Tu ești ajutorul meu, stânca și turnul meu, ancorat în dragostea ta, victoria-i de partea mea. Tu ești ajutorul meu, stânca și turnul meu, ancorat în dragostea ta, victoria-i de partea mea. Tu ești ajutorul meu, stânca și turnul meu, ancorat în dragostea ta, victoria-i de partea mea. În autoritatea ta eu voi cânta, te voi lăuda, chiar de lupta-mi pare grea. În credința mea voi proclama, în autoritatea ta eu voi cânta, te voi lăuda, chiar de lupta-mi pare grea. În credința mea voi proclama biruința ta, biruința ta.
În numele tău proclamăm Duh de viață. Cred într-un singur Dumnezeu, Creatorul la toate. Cred în Iisus ce-a murit pentru a mele păcate. Cred în Duhul Sfânt trimis, El a mea îndrumare. Cred în viața veșnică ce o am după moarte. Cred în nașterea din nou și în biserica vie. Cred în Sfântul lui cuvânt și în împărtășire. Cred în semne și minuni și în Sfânta Treime. Cred în roada Duhului și în daruri divine. Credincios până la capăt voi fi, regelui ce pe cruce a murit. El prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus, El e vrednic să fie onorat. Domnul luptă pentru noi, cine-i va sta împotrivă? Pentru cei răscumpărați, cine acuze ridică? Iisus a murit pentru a noastră înfiere și la dreapta Tatălui pentru noi mijlocește. Credincios până la capăt voi fi, regelui ce pe cruce a murit. El prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus, El e vrednic să fie onorat. Vrednic este mielul junghiat, El prin moarte ne-a răscumpărat și prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus. El e vrednic să fie regelui ce pe cruce a murit. El prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus, el e vrednic să fie onorat. Vrednic este mielul junghiat, el prin moarte ne-a răscumpărat și prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus, el e vrednic să fie onorat. Prin goană, lipsuri sau sabie, de el nu m-a despărțit. Eu am victorie de plină prin cel ce nespus de mult m-a iubit. Nici înger, demon sau moarte nu m-ar putea clătina. Știu cui slujesc și cui mă închin, în dragoste sunt ancorat. Credincios până la capăt voi fi, regelui ce pe cruce a murit. El prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus, el e vrednic să fie onorat. Vrednic este mielul junghiat, el prin moarte ne-a răscumpărat și prin sângele curs a plătit prețul pus, el e vrednic să fie onorat.
Tot ce am aduc acum înaintea ta, cu tot ce sunt mă închin, Iisus, în fața ta. Tot ce am aduc acum înaintea ta, cu tot ce sunt mă închin, Iisus, în
Când eram în întristare, cu vocea ta m-ai liniștit. Și când nu aveam scăpare, mâna ta m-a izbăvit. Când eram în întristare, cu vocea ta m-ai liniștit. Și când nu aveam scăpare, mâna ta m-a izbăvit. De aceea-ți cânt, Tu ești Domnul meu pe veci, credincios și vrednic ești, doar pe Tine te voi lăuda. Doamne, ești iubirea mea, Tu ești Domnul meu pe veci, credincios și vrednic ești, doar pe Tine te voi lăuda. Doamne, ești iubirea mea.
Pace, bine ați venit la Friday night. Seems like săptămâna asta am venit la biserică de atâtea ori, cred că niciodată n-am fost așa mai pocăiți ca săptămâna asta. But it's a good thing, and I want to read to you from Isaiah 42 what the word of the Lord says. And it says, cântați Domnului o cântare nouă, cântați laudele Lui până la marginile pământului. Voi care mergeți pe mare și cei ce locuiți în ea, ostroave și locuitorii lor. Și vom citi și chapter 43. This is what the word of the Lord says. Eu sunt Domnul, Sfântul vostru, Făcătorul lui Israel, Împăratul vostru. Așa vorbește Domnul, care a croit un drum pe mare și o cărare pe apele cele puternice, care a scos care și cai, o oștire și războinici viteji, culcați deodată împreună ca să nu se mai scoale nimic și stinși ca un mute de întuneric. Nu prea se vede de aici, sorry. Și this is where I wanted to get to. Nu vă mai gândiți la ce a fost înainte și nu vă mai uitați la cele vechi. Iată, voi face ceva nou și e gata să se întâmple. Să nu-l cunoașteți voi oare? Voi face un drum prin pustie și râuri în locuri secetoase. Și vom asculta în seara aceasta un mesaj potrivit pentru ce se întâmplă. Și aș vrea să ne amintim asta și să ne încurajăm, pentru că Dumnezeu vrea să facă, chiar în aceste momente, chiar în aceste zile în care trăim, vrea să facă lucruri noi cu biserica Lui și noi suntem biserica Lui. Vă invit să ne ridicăm și haideți să-i mulțumim Lui pentru această seară și să-i cerem să ne vorbească și să ne putem conecta cu El. Haideți să ne rugăm. Doamne, îți mulțumim pentru că Tu ești bun, Doamne, și nu-i nimeni ca Tine. Îți mulțumim că suntem în prezența Ta și că suntem aici, Doamne, și putem să-ți dăm glorie numelui Tău, putem să onorăm numele Tău cel Sfânt. Doamne, nu vrem să ne uităm la lucrurile care au fost și să vedem că niciodată nu se vor mai întâmpla. Nu vrem să credem că Tu ți-ai terminat lucrarea și că să înainte, nu vă mai uitați la lucruri vechi trecute. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. țări mari veți vedea, mai mult decât înainte. Am lucruri noi să fac și-s gata să se întâmple. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Voi face un drum chiar prin pustie, în locuri uscate va curge apă vie. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Vă dau Duhul meu, vă îmbrac în putere, națiuni vor cunoaște căile mele. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Spuneți celor slabi, fiți tari și nu vă temeți, mâinile întăriți, în mine mă încredeți. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Voi face un drum chiar prin pustie, în locuri uscate va curge apă vie. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Vă dau Duhul meu, vă îmbrac în putere, națiuni vor cunoaște căile mele. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Atunci chiopii vor sări, orbii vor vedea, surzii vor auzi, iar glasul celor muți va cânta. Atunci chiopii vor sări, orbii vor vedea, surzii vor auzi, iar glasul celor muți va cânta. Voi face un drum chiar prin pustie, în locuri uscate va curge apă vie. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Vă dau Duhul meu, vă îmbrac în putere, națiuni vor cunoaște căile mele. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Voi face un drum chiar prin pustie, în locuri uscate va curge apă vie. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Vă dau Duhul meu, vă îmbrac în putere, națiuni vor cunoaște căile mele. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Iată, eu voi face lucruri noi. Iată ce voi face, eu voi face lucruri noi. Okay, let's start over. În numele Tău proclamă Duh de viață, în numele Tău se ridică o armată. din oase moarte îți ridici un popor să te slujească. Acolo unde-i Duhul tău curge viață. În numele tău proclamăm Duh de viață. În numele tău se ridică o armată. Din oase moarte îți ridici un popor să te slujească. Acolo unde-i Duhul tău curge viață. Trec prin vale, printr-un loc pustiu și ster, plin de oase ce suscate, fără viață, scop și țel. Dar m-ai chemat să chem viață, Duhul celui Sfânt de sus, să vestesc eliberare celor ce sunt lanțuri puși. În numele tău proclamăm Duh de viață. În numele tău se ridică o armată. Din oase moarte îți ridici un popor să te slujească. Acolo unde-i Duhul tău curge viață. În numele tău, în numele tău proclamăm Duh de viață. În numele tău se ridică o armată. Din oase moarte îți ridici un popor să te slujească. Acolo unde-i Duhul tău curge viață. slujească acolo unde-i Duhul tău, curge viață. fost mereu atât de bun și cât eu voi avea suflare, vreau să cânt bunătatea ta.
Vocea ta m-ai condus prin încercare și noaptea grea, lângă mine tu ai fost. Noi te avem ca tată, te știm ca prieten bun. Am trăit bunătatea ta. Tu mereu ai fost cu mine,
Doamne, ai fost mereu atât de bun și cât eu voi avea suflare, vreau să cânt bunătatea ta. Tu mereu ai fost cu mine, Doamne, ai fost mereu atât de bun și cât eu voi avea suflare, vreau să cânt bunătatea ta. Iisus, mă copleșești cu bunătatea ta. Iisus, mă copleșești cu bunătatea ta. Mă aplec acum ție, mă închin, cu totul mă predau. Iisus, mă copleșești cu bună. Haideți să cântăm bunătatea lui Iisus. Iisus, mă copleșești cu bunătatea ta. Iisus, mă copleșești cu bunătatea ta. Mă aplec acum ție, mă închin, cu totul mă predau. Iisus, mă copleșești cu bunătatea ta. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am able, I'm gonna sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.
Da, Doamne, Tu ai fost și ești credincios și în această seară prezența noastră aici este o dovadă în plus a faptului că și Tu ai fost credincios față de noi. Chiar dacă noi de multe ori nu ne-am ridicat la înălțimea așteptărilor pe care Tu le ai de la noi. Îți mulțumim astăzi, toți care suntem aici, pentru acest prilej pe care îl avem de a putea să ne închinăm împreună, de a putea să înălțăm numele Tău și de a putea apoi, Doamne, să privim la viețile noastre, să privim aici în societatea noastră, să vedem modul în care Tu ne vrei să luminăm în această societate și să ne trezești, să putem să vedem ce se întâmplă aici în jurul nostru. Îți mulțumim că și Tu ești Domnul care lași pe mai departe viețile noastre ca o mărturie vie aici în acest colț de pământ, Doamne. Și mă rog acum pentru George, te rog ca Tu să-l binecuvântezi, să lași ungerea Ta peste el, Doamne. Îți mulțumesc pentru oameni ca el care s-au dedicat în a ne deschide ochii, în a ne face conștienți de ceea ce trebuie să facem și de poziția pe care trebuie să o avem în această societate a întunericului, în această societate în care suntem atacați de cel rău. Binecuvântează-l, deci, pe George, binecuvântează toți care suntem aici și ajută-ne, Doamne, să putem să punem în aplicare tot ceea ce vom auzi aici și îndemnurile pe care Tu ni le dai. Îți mulțumim în numele Domnului Iisus Hristos. Amin. Nu vă așezați, vă rog, pentru că vreau să vă rog să veniți mai în față. Mă pun în locul lui George și nu mi-ar place să vorbesc la oameni acolo. Haideți aici în față, pe primele 4 bănci, vă rog frumos. Dacă vă supărați pe mine, e ok, o să vă treacă până la duminică. Haideți mai în față, vă rog frumos. Haideți. Good. Haideți, aveți curaj. Până atunci, aș vrea să îl introduc pe George, măcar că mulți dintre noi îl știm. Aș vrea să încep prin a saluta inițiativa Departamentului Men's Ministry de a organiza o seară ca aceasta, de a putea să medităm la niște subiecte legate de societatea în care trăim. Pentru că fiecare din noi știm, suntem oameni, suntem cetățeni ai acestei țări și vrem într-adevăr să ne cunoaștem drepturile, vrem să cunoaștem ce se întâmplă în jurul nostru. Pe George îl cunoaștem și azi dimineața am scris: George, te rog să-mi scrii toate organizațiile în care ești implicat. Și am văzut că de când am verificat cu el ultima dată, să mai adăugat vreo 2. Mă uit la George și când mă gândesc la modul în care Dumnezeu l-a binecuvântat, are un rezume demn de invidiat. În primul rând, are păr pe cap. Are o freză frumoasă. Yes. No, that was a joke, ca să deschid un pic. În ceea ce privește biserica, în ceea ce privește implicarea în lucrare, George este pastor la New Hope Church, știm lucrul acesta, dar Dumnezeu l-a binecuvântat și cu o voce extraordinară, este un om care are o voce deosebită și știți că de obicei în perioada Crăciunului vine împreună cu West Coast și ne binecuvintează și George, te rog să nu abandonezi acest obicei care l-ai frumos. În ceea ce privește cariera, George iar este un om realizat, este Associate Vice President la HDR Design Firm, un om, iată, care l-am întrebat odată câți ani are și mi-a spus, dar nu o să spun pentru că și am zis, tânăr, repede ai ajuns sus pe scara societății. Iată un alt lucru pentru care este demn de invidiat. Ceea ce privește familia, George este un soț, are căsătorit cu Angie, are 4 copii, 3 băieți și o fetiță și am lăsat la urmă următorul lucru în ceea ce privește societatea și implicarea lui în societate. George este un activist în sensul că vrea să schimbe ceva din societatea aceasta. Și pentru că este un tată și pentru că este un soț, George, cred că o să ne spună el când a simțit chemarea aceasta, probabil după ce a devenit tată, de a se implica puțin și a putea să vadă ce se întâmplă în jurul nostru. So, am aici o listă întreagă. Founding board member for Protect Our Kids. Number 2, co-founder of Informed Parents of California, an alliance to protect children. Number 3, advisor to Massachusetts Informed Parents and New York Alliance to Protect Children. Number 4 este, nu? Am pierdut? Member of Protect Child Health Coalition. Number 5, ambassador for Alliance Defending Freedom. Dar dincolo de toate, George este un om al lui Dumnezeu și un om de la care putem să învățăm în această seară și vă spuneam, miercuri seara vă spuneam un lucru. Este bine să ascultăm de la oameni care și-au făcut bine homework-ul și care știu exact ce spun. Pentru că, vedeți, circulă pe internet tot felul de mini-clips, tot felul de povești, toată lumea ne sperie, tot felul de conspirații. George este un om care și-a făcut bine homework-ul și poate să ne spună câteva lucruri deosebit de importante pe care trebuie să le ținem minte. Și, dincolo de toate, aș vrea să mai afirm încă un lucru pentru care George este demn de invidiat. Este un bărbat cu coloană vertebrală, care stă în picioare pentru ceea ce crede. Și George, ca și români, noi ne mândrim că avem un român ca și tine în comunitatea românească. Nu uita că ți-am făcut o profeție. Am profețit odată și câteodată le mai nimeresc, măcar că sunt pastor. George, you will make a difference în societatea asta, poate chiar și în lumea politică. Acum, rămâne între tine și Domnul și o să văd dacă eu sunt profet fals sau că am nimerit-o. Domnul să binecuvânteze. Let's welcome George.
And that will be between God and my wife. Oh, man. Thank you, Pastor Karina. I wasn't expecting that. I also wasn't expecting to see women and children here tonight. And that's no offense to women and children. I was told this was going to be a men's ministry meeting. So I think the women and children are going to get a kick out of this. Seriously, I had no clue there was going to be women and children here tonight because I prepared probably one of the most stern speeches I've ever given in my life. And so I think, ladies, you guys have all the right. I'm not talking to you tonight, okay? Just look at your husband and say, see? Now, I will preface that by also saying that if you have any marriage counseling needs after that, to see Pastor Krini, don't come talk to me, okay? All right. Here is, amongst us Romanians, we have a saying, ai aceeași poezie, right? I think if you've heard me speak, you've probably heard me talk on this topic a lot. And tonight, I have a very different twist to this message because I want to speak to men. I want to speak to men, and I want to start off with a verse that touched me. Do we have the PowerPoint up here by any chance? Okay, it's bright for you guys, okay. I want to talk about a godly man's duty. A godly man's duty. And once we understand that, you'll see why the rest of the presentation that I'm going to give will roll right back into this. A godly man who understands the importance and the history of Christian education. Because if you've seen what other godly men did in the past and sacrificed and placed as a critical emphasis in their lives when it came to education, not just for themselves and their families, but for society at large, you'll see what I'm going to be talking about. Godly men who comprehend the worldview in which they reside. There's always a majority worldview in whatever country you're going to live in. There's a majority worldview. And those ideas behind why that society is structured that way, it's very important to understand. Then the implications of that worldview. Then I want to give you just a brief update on where we stand today in terms of the laws and the education ecosystem as a whole. And then I want to equip men on how to critique the narrative. Because we hear a lot of things and we process them in Christianese and we speak back in Christianese and it flies over people's heads. Because we need to be able to contextualize our responses with words and with phrases that our neighbors who have a completely different worldview will understand. And lastly, I want to present to you some very available involvement options and solutions. So the very first one, a godly man's duty. If you recall when David became a king at Hebron, we are told in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32, and the verses before this and the verse after this, he had all of the tribes coming to him. One tribe was bringing 30,000 soldiers. The other tribe was going to bring 45,000. But when it came to the tribe of Issachar, they brought something completely different. And it says this, of the sons of Issachar who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do, their chiefs were 200, and all their brethren were at their command. David recognized that out of all of the fighting soldiers that he was about to get, which was a big deal in their world back then, for protection, for strength, for might. But he prized these 200 men of Issachar above and beyond anybody else. David knew how to surround himself with godly men who understood the times and who also understood what Israel ought to do. In that time frame, there was a shift of the kingdom from Saul to David. And from David onwards, we know from prophecy that God was going to establish David's throne forever, obviously through Jesus in perpetuity. But these men knew what was going on. They knew what was happening. They knew why David had to become king. In our day and age, God is asking us, are we godly men who not just understand, right? I would love to just be able to sit back, study scripture and theology all day and be able just to interpret doctrines and, do all that stuff. But these men weren't just like that. They also understood the actions that needed to be taken, what Israel ought to do. And so that is my challenge for you men here tonight. If you leave tonight forgetting my entire speech except for this one thing here, then you've left with a lot. Do you want to be like the men of Issachar who understood the times and who understood what they ought to do? 2 more Bible verses I want to bring before you. Number 1 is our call to be salt and light. Our call to be salt and light in culture and wherever we are at is a calling for everybody. It's not a calling for pastors. It's not a calling for Christians who then happen to go into politics and give up, give civic duty. No. It is a call to all believers. And so men, you have to ask yourself every single day, how am I being salt and light where I'm at? And thirdly, Paul writes to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 11, and he says, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. We like this part because it's all about our, holiness, trying to stick away from bad things. But it continues and it says, but rather expose them. How do we do that? And who does that? Whose responsibility is it? Paul wrote this letter to the church in Ephesus, a church where he spent quite a bit of time, from which it was his springboard to all of Asia Minor to disciple and to evangelize. And he was telling these Christians, you have a very important duty in your society. You think there wasn't a bunch of evil back then? There was a bunch. And if you study history, you'll know especially what was going on back then in terms of how women were treated, how kids were treated, how slaves were treated. And yet the Christians of that day and age civilized the entire Roman Empire. And when the Roman Empire fell in 450 AD, and the pagans of northern tribes of Europe came in, and they brought in with all their paganism, St. Augustine wrote a book called A Tale of Two Cities, the city of God or the city of man, referring to Rome. And he said, we as Christians, what are we to do? We're to go right back in and preach the gospel to the next generation. And so Christians spent decades and centuries Christianizing the rest of Europe, and then from there on out. These men, our forefathers, understood the times, understood what they ought to do, and understood the responsibility on exposing evil. So with that, I want to provide you the sad reality for us as men that we have to think about. When I got involved in this battle over our education system, I found out within the first 6 months that 80% of the people involved were women. We started Informed Parents of California in June of 2018. 6 months later, we went from just being the three of us founders on a Facebook group to almost 30,000 people on that Facebook group. And we get the data and the statistics from all the analytics that Facebook provides us on the back end as administrators. And never did that number, that percentage breakdown between male and females, ever go under 80%. And I'm like, what's going on? Where are the men? And I started then talking with women who had been involved in this battle for way longer than I have. And they said, George, this has been our problem for decades. The men are nowhere to be found. And we as women are exhausted. Everybody thinks that we're just at home taking care of kids and taking kids, to school, and then we have free time, and so that's why we get to put an extra time into this stuff. And no, we don't. I've met women with 6 children, with 4 children, with 7 children. They are doing all of this while they are taking care of their households. And so men, I ask, where are we in this fight? It is a sad reality. Secondly, men, I want you to know that this is a spiritual warfare. This is a spiritual warfare, and it's not one of those things that, you need to have 20 years of pocăință și poți să discerni acum că vai vine satana pe aici, right? No. It's right out. It's right out. In the California State Health Framework, in the chapter dealing with the middle school health curriculum, it says clearly the definition for spiritual abuse. What do you mean spiritual abuse? First of all, in their worldview, there is no spiritual dimension, so why even use that term? There's just the material. So for the first time, they acknowledge there's a spiritual dimension, but they define it as anyone insisting that gender is binary in that there are rigid gender roles. For us as pastors and as men who preach every single, Sunday from the pulpit, and when we happen to preach about marriage or about, life, and we say that God created them male and female and He called it good, we are spiritually abusing the children who are listening to us. That's what the state of California has defined it. BLM says in their ethnic studies that we must now chant to our ancestors. And by chanting their names, we're not just remembering them. We are invoking their spirits. We are invoking their spirits. And all of this ancestral pagan worship is coming right into our children's curriculum. Men, this is spiritual warfare. What are we doing? My dad told me about a book recently, and I was able to procure it from Romania. It's titled Apostolii Banatului. And it takes on the story of 2 very influential early men of the faith back from the late 20s, all the way it traces their life into the early 1990s. And it talks about these 2 men, and it talks about how the faith grew in Romania and it expanded in the evangelical realm. And what struck me was the amount of demonic resistance that they had to encounter. And I look at our day and age, and G.K. Chesterton said one thing about 100 years ago in his book called Orthodoxy. He says, atheists, men without God, don't believe in anything. They believe in anything. They don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything. What happens as a culture in general, whenever you see a culture tend towards atheism, the first generation becomes kind of, somewhat loose atheist, second, somewhat hardcore atheist. But by the time you get to the third or the fourth, they start to live an unlivable reality because they start asking themselves these questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is right? And where am I going? The 4 fundamental questions that every worldview asks. And what we are seeing here today in America is this transition into paganism for Generation Z, and even my generation in Generation Y. So we are seeing now that this is truly out in front spiritual warfare. The last thing that I think is a sad reality, and this I bring it home for us as Romanians, is what are we doing as survivors of socialism? What are we doing? We sometimes carry it as a badge of honor, right? Yeah. You can turn this one off. We carry it as a badge of honor. And wherever I go, I like to talk about my background as a Romanian, because the things that we detect so quickly in the mass media and the propaganda, it just makes sense to us. It's like, oh, we see right through that, right? But is it good enough as Romanians living in America just to say, oh, I see through all of this, and go on and live your life? Is that what God is calling us to do? Is that why maybe God brought us here? Why? I think God has a very interesting purpose for the Romanian people in America. And not just in America, but if you look at Europe in general, and all the Romanians that went out of Romania and into Europe, there's probably over 1 million Romanians in Europe. I hadn't known this until a friend from Romania told me, but the total born-again Christian population in Romania is greater than the rest of Europe combined. The total born-again Christian population in Romania is greater than the rest of Europe combined. And so when all of these Romanian Christians move out, what do? Do we take our faith with us? Do we expose the darkness in which we are placed? So with that, I want to at least just unlock a little bit of your understanding about why Christian education is so important. Number one is because in our worldview, education is not just utilitarian, but it stems from a God who does something and who is something. The more and more that you have to adopt an atheistic worldview, you have to look at education as, well, we need carpenters in our society. Well, we need, pilots in our society. We need all of these people. And you just see them as a certain occupation. It's very utilitarian in nature. But with God and in the Christian worldview, it's very different. First of all, why is education important to us as Christians is because we serve a God who wants to be known. And how do you discover this God other than through the process of educating yourself? First, and secondly, we serve a God who has created an order and a knowable universe. So when we come down to the fact of education in and of itself, from any other worldview, there's really no other purpose and meaning behind education but strictly utilitarian. When you look at it from a Christian standpoint, Christians are able to now start asking the questions that got us to discover the universe. Who looked up at the sky and said, wonderful lights. All right, let me go on. It was the Christians who looked up at the sky and said, wow, the Lord made stars. I wonder how far they are away from us. I wonder, why is one a little more red and another one kind of like a blue and another one kind of a little more white? And as they asked more and more questions, and as they said, we want to be able to see them, and as you get different telescopes and different things, we started to understand that that light has different wavelengths, and from those wavelengths we can start interpreting data and understanding why red stars are what they are, why dwarf stars are what they are. All these questions we keep on asking because it is driven and it stems out of this desire to know what God has done in our universe, to know how to shepherd his creation. And because God has given us this capacity to know. And so education is very important. In America, the very first book that was used to educate all American children, or most American children, was the Bible. From the very beginning in the early 1620s, when the first settlers came here, they used the Bible as their main source of education. 150 years later, right after we won the revolution, do you know what was one of the very first acts of Congress that they did? They ordered 10,000 Bibles, paid with taxpayer dollars, to distribute to all the 13 colonies to aid in the education of this nation, because it was James Madison at that time who said that we have a constitutional republic if we have given it to you, if you can keep it. And he also said that our form of government was meant for a moral people. Without education, without virtuous education, they recognized that society would crumble. These were just some genius men. And they weren't genius men because they had access to an iPhone. No, they were genius men because they had the wisdom of God through scriptures implanted in them. And so what happened afterwards and from the late 1800s is we saw this transition. We saw that this push, obviously demonic in nature, to bring in atheism and to let go of the Bible as the primary source of teaching and to switch over to secularism, a very utilitarian way of teaching, a way of removing virtue and morals out of society. And so here we are, 150 years later, experiencing the consequences of these decisions. So, because as Romanians we understand communism, I think it's going to be pretty easy for us to comprehend the worldview that we are up against. So I want to give you just a brief history about Marxism, because Marxism is the underlying worldview, and Marxism is just a theory on social conflict. Karl Marx was trying to look at society at large, and he was trying to think like, how do we solve all of society's problems, and can I reduce it to one way of looking at all those problems? He reduced it to what he thought was a genius thought. He said, you know what? All of society's problems are purely materialistic, because what I see, if I dumb it down to the lowest common denominator, is poor people and rich people, and this is a perpetuous class warfare. Well, Marxist ideology applied to economics is what we call communism, okay? Well, what we have here today is Marxism 2.0. So Marx's disciples started in the early 1920s what was known as the Frankfurt School. This is back in Germany. It became known as the Frankfurt School. You had Max Horkheimer, you had Herbert Marcuse, and others who basically they were the disciples of Marx. Antonio Gramsci, a famous Italian. And what they observed was like, okay, look, our granddaddy Marx, he tried his ideas. They've been adopted in Russia. They've been adopted in China later on, but something's wrong. In Western civilization, this idea is not catching on. And they asked themselves, why? Well, they realized that in the Western nations, because those Western nations had a Judeo-Christian foundation, these Western nations were beginning to prosper. The Industrial Revolution from the 1850s and 1860s, which started in America, was catching now like wildfire in Europe as well, and in Western Europe in particular. And they said, you know what? They really don't have poor and rich. They have kind of a stratification. They have very rich, rich, semi-rich, middle class. We can't go over there and preach to them the gospel of communism. It's not going to work. So then what do we do? So this is what they came up with. They basically took Karl Marx's idea that was applied strictly to economics, and they called it critical theory, and they applied it to every aspect of society. So here's Critical Theory, Marxism 2.0. Critical theory looks at all of our reality, not just as strictly class warfare. It generalizes it even more. It says there's an oppressor category and an oppressed category. And so now when you look at economics, it's the rich versus the poor. When you look at sex, it is the heterosexual versus the LGBTQ. When you look at race, it's white people versus everybody of color, all right? So that is the way, and that's how they applied Marxism into critical theory. Now, Herbert Marcuse ended up coming as Hitler started gaining power. Their Frankfurt school started to be taken apart. And so Herbert Marcuse came actually to the United States. And he started teaching at Columbia University. Then he went on to teach at Harvard University. This is in the 50s. And in the 60s, he came all the way out here to UC San Diego. Now, what happened in America in the 1960s? The sexual revolution, right? And at least for over the last 15 years, I've been very aware of the sexual revolution in America, and I've studied it quite a bit. But it's really only been in the last 3 years that I've finally understood its roots. Because they presented themselves in the 1960s as victims. We are being oppressed. We are not being granted the freedoms that are afforded to us under the Constitution of the United States of America. But they were perverting the definition of freedom. Because without morality, words like justice, words like freedom, words like love have no meaning. And so as we talk in society and with our neighbors, we have to challenge our neighbors on these ideas and say, what is your definition of love? If you think that these people are being victimized, and if you think that their rights are being trampled upon, what is your definition of justice? And let them start rolling and spinning their hamster wheels and figure out that through these questions, they'll see they're going to hit a dead end. There's no way to define these terms anymore. There's another very important word that we need to know, and that is the word intersectionality. Intersectionality takes multiple intersecting categories of victimhood or degrees of oppression. And so now if you happen to be, let's just take the class aside, right? You're poor, okay? You have 1 degree of victimhood. Yay. All right, now if you happen to be poor and black, all right, you have 2 degrees of victimhood. You're even more oppressed. If you happen to be poor and black and a female, you have a 3rd degree of victimhood. And if you also happen to be a lesbian on top of that, you have a 4th degree of victimhood. And what they claim is that in this oppressor versus oppressed categories, you as the oppressed, your lived experience is something that you are only able to understand. You can't, as a poor person, try to help a rich person understand you. So you have access to truths that the oppressor category does not have access to. All right? So this is a very critical point, because whenever, and especially, when you go in front of board meetings and you see that now, right after a white male Christian comes a lesbian black woman and she speaks, the board members that are against you will look at her and say, oh, poor her, and the things she's suffering, and to have even endured the speech that white Christian male gave before her, it was completely oppressive and uncalled for. This is how they think. So I, as that white Christian male, I don't have access to the truths that other person has. So intersectionality, which is now linked to postmodernism, which just basically says that truth is relative. Your truth versus my truth. Facts and then alternative facts, right? As we got to see it during all of the Supreme Court nominations. I want you to listen to this video if you want to put play from back there.
Clear ideological structuring might be of some value here, but how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
That was Patrice Cullors. She's one of the 3 co-founders of BLM. And she was being asked, like, okay, are you guys just a bunch of, Gen Y kids running around, And she's like, no. We have an ideological framework. We understand philosophy better than you do. We've studied it all. We're actually trained Marxists. This is their ideology. Now, Patrice Cullors also happens to be an aspiring capitalist. If you've heard, she's purchased a $1.4 million mansion in Topanga Canyon, and she built a wall around it. She was also out in the Caribbean, I forget which island, pretty secluded island, only like rich Hollywood people. She also purchased an estate there. And so recently, about 4 months ago, it was discovered that she made all these purchases, and so she had to step down from the BLM board because she's not socialist anymore. She's acting like a capitalist. But what you have to see is that you have to be able to take these kind of things and ask of your neighbors and ask of the people you come into contact with, like, do you know what BLM is all about? Do you know all of this stuff? Most people actually have no clue, okay? I love this saying in Romanian, sunt prost de sinceri, stupidly sincere, right? That's how most people are, okay? And all the conversations, most of the conversations I have with people at work and my neighbors, they just don't know. They hear the talking points from CNN and they go after that. And they are sincere in the kind of from the angle that they actually want people to have opportunities, to excel, to go to the best schools, to do all of that. But yet they don't realize the principles by which these people live their lives and aspire to bring in to the education system.
Clear idea.
All right. So now, understanding Marxism, and then Marxism 2.0, oppressor versus oppressed categories, and what critical theory means, what intersectionality means, these are the implications. Every time you hear anything, just think critical theory, and in between these 2 words, put whatever word you're talking about. If you're talking about sex, okay, critical sex theory. I'm talking about hetero versus LGBTQ. If it's race, critical race theory, all right? We're talking about blacks versus whites, people of color versus people of no color. But white is a color, so I still don't get it. The next thing that I want you to understand is this concept of sexual rights. And this one is very important. And so, Josh, if you can help me out, we're going to have to switch out of the PowerPoint into a video. Just about 2.5 minutes of this video. The concept of sexual rights is supremely disturbing. And so I want you to just listen to this video real quick. What are sexual rights? If you are like me, you have probably heard of civil rights and human rights, but never about sexual rights. Coined by Planned Parenthood, this new terminology is critical to understand due to the fundamental shift it creates in our public education system. If sexual rights are elevated to the status of human rights, then they are due to every person, regardless of age, and must be taught to young people in school. But where do these supposed rights come from? The state or our Creator, as described in the Declaration of Independence? Both the phrase and its definition were coined by the International Planned Parenthood Federation in a document titled Sexual Rights, an IPPF Declaration, which was formally adopted by that organization in May 2008. As the IPPF stated, panel members agreed that the development of a Declaration of Sexual Rights was fundamental to the realization of IPPF's vision and mission. They went on to state that sexual rights are human rights related to sexuality. Sexual rights are constituted by a set of entitlements related to sexuality that emanate from the rights to freedom, equality, privacy, autonomy, integrity, and dignity of all people. Notice the clever interweaving of human rights language and ascribing them to sexual rights. They go on to define 10 key sexual rights due to every human being. In order to understand these, we must first inspect the new definition of sexuality and sexual rights as developed by Planned Parenthood. The term sexuality, as defined by Planned Parenthood and then formally adopted by the World Health Organization, encompasses sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy and reproduction, thoughts, fantasies, desires, beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors. From here on out, whenever the word sexuality is used in the Sexual Rights Declaration, keep in mind this definition. So this is very important for the following reason. Planned Parenthood put out 10 declarations for sexual rights, and they're saying that sexual rights are equal to human rights. Now, I want to ask you, when you hear human rights, what do you think of? Yeah? When you think of human rights that have been violated in the past, what do you think of? World War II, the Jews, atrocities, right? And we fought entire world wars over human rights. They're saying that if you violate any of our 10 declarations for a person's sexual right, you are violating, in fact, their human right. One of those 10 declarations was the right to comprehensive sexuality education. And so if we as parents don't allow our children to receive that kind of education, you are violating your child's human rights. You as a parent are violating your child's human rights. So now you have the full force of the law that can come and give whatever consequences deemed necessary. So sexual rights is very important to understand. Then there are some laws, because I mentioned that happened in 2008, and I asked myself, where was I in 2008? Why didn't I know? In 2004, even before that, our governor at that time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, actually passed this law in the Title V of the Education Code, which redefined gender to mean one's perceived identity. So children from 2004 in the school system could have declared themselves whatever they wanted. And even though you can perceive something different by what their biological reality is, you as a teacher, as a parent, could not go against what they were saying. In 2011, we had the Fair Education Act, which was basically changing our entire history curriculum to now bring in and celebrate LGBTQ figures. In 2013, the bathroom bill was signed, which basically meant that now any boy or girl can use the restroom of their choice on any given day. They can change it as many times as they want. They cannot be questioned about it. And culminating in 2015 with the California Healthy Youth Act, which brings the comprehensive sexuality education. So the other thing I wanted to share here is how does the education ecosystem work in America? You have three major buckets, and I call these the trifecta. You have the government side, because you have departments of education that, for example, at the federal level, there is a federal Department of Education. Within the state level, there's state departments of education. At the county level, there's a county board of education, and then there's local school districts. Now, those places are all run by a board of elected officials, or a lot of times they're appointed officials. Usually at the local level, your local school district, it's an elected official. So you actually have to go out and campaign and be voted on. At the state level and the federal level, those are typically appointed positions by the governor or the president of the United States. But then you have the unions. The unions are super powerful. And the most powerful union in America is the teachers' union. They are the NEA. And that's their national umbrella, the National Educators Association. They have state affiliations in every single state. So here in California, it's the CTA, the California Teachers Association. And then the CTA is made up of, in every school district, there is a local teachers union chapter that has a president, and that president usually is a representative to the state level. So these unions, they collect about, here in California, I think about $1,200 a year out of their teachers' dues. So whatever the teacher's salary might be per year, $1,200 goes to the teachers' union. A portion of it stays local. A portion of it goes to the state chapters. A portion of it goes to the national chapter. In California, the CTA alone has 325,000 teachers. Multiply that by 1,200, you have about $350 million every single year. Every single year. A large portion of that goes to fund campaigns, political campaigns. If you look at Governor Gavin Newsom, his biggest donor was the teachers' union. If you look locally at your school boards, why are school boards against parents? Because who has the money to front a political campaign for a school board member? Do parents have all that money? No, it's the local teachers union. So here we are in Yorba Linda. If you look up like Yorba Linda Teachers Association, you'll be able to Google them and you can find them. And if you go to the Placentia Yorba Linda School District, you'll be able to see that they have about, I think, like 21 or 22,000 kids. It'll show you how many teacher employees they have, which I'm sure it's well over 1,000. So multiply their portion that they get out of that 1,200 that goes to their local chapter, and then their local chapter, they usually know that, hey, it takes about $10,000, $15,000 just for every 4 years to give to, these 5 board members that are going to stand up for us, and we'll get them elected. So when we as parents go to the local school boards, we can talk till we're blue in the face because they have a master that they serve, and it's not us. So I want us to understand that, because this is, unfortunately, any system of government can be hacked, all right? And so the other side has figured it out, and the unions have figured it out big time. Why? Because when you look at the leadership structure within the unions, it's not like you have a teacher who's a full-time teacher, and then on the side she's also the president of the union chapter, and then on the side she's also a mom of 4 kids, and then on the side she's also involved in her local church. No. She gets paid a full-time salary just to be the teachers' union representative president. And what do these people do for 40 hours a week? They fight against you and me. So we are not just at a disadvantage financially, but we're at a disadvantage time-wise, because this is all they do. They think, they devise, they strategize, they scheme against us. Now, I'm a very competitive person. And so for me, when I got into this, I said, you know what? I played to win. I'm not going to lose this battle. And one of the things that that I have hope for, and I've told it to so many of the people on the other side, is that, look, I know that me here, standing here, you might not, be afraid of me. You don't have to be afraid of me, but you at least afraid in the sense of like, oh, I'm going to lose my, my power next election because George is going to come and run for it, or somebody else is going to come run for it, or parents are going to come up in arms. I've framed it this way. You've heard of the saying, death by 1,000 cuts? The only way that we can overturn the union's power is if we do a death by 1,000,000 parental cuts. It's going to take 1,000,000 parents in America to rise up and to create a ruckus and to say, no, the state does not own my child. The teachers union does not own my child. Parents own their children. Now, the good news is that something recently happened. Have you guys heard about what the Attorney General of the United States has put out in response to the National Association of School Board letter that called parents domestic terrorists? Okay, so this just happened in the last 2 weeks. Every one of these, so besides teachers' unions, there's over 90,000 school board members in America, and they have their own association called the National School Board Association. They have state chapters, and then they have their local chapters, and each one of these gets dues, right, out of our public money. And then there are the School Nurses Association, and then there are the School Superintendent Association, and then there is the School Counselor Association. Do you see what I'm going at? Every single occupation in the education ecosystem has an association that gets money from taxpayers, and then they give it to these associations. They have full-time positions, and all they do is work against us. How do we put an offensive against them? So in the last 3.5 years, my main focus has been on educating parents and waking parents up to go and to speak at school board meetings. And 2 things have given me hope. Number one, the Attorney General of the United States, by agreeing with the National School Board Members Association's letter calling parents domestic terrorists, and he is now weaponizing the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Secret Service, and a couple other agencies to, in the next 30 days, they have to meet and start working on a strategy on how to shut parents down from speaking at school board meetings. To me, what that means is that we have finally caught the attention of our opponent. We have finally caught the attention of our opponent. That means we are doing something right. That means there are millions of parents in America saying we have had enough. So I praise God for that. And then the last thing is the nonprofits. So here in California, we just seem to not know how much money we can ever spend within the education system, because through our taxpayer dollars, we're spending almost $15,000 per child every single year, and there's 6.2 million children in the public school system. So multiply 6.2 million times 15,000, and you are now getting a billions and billions of dollars worth of budget for education. And we rank in the bottom of the 50 states, down in the bottom. So every school district is complaining that they don't have money for this program, they don't have money for this, their teachers are overworked. And there's a lot of truth to that. But here's what happens. There are nonprofits now, like Planned Parenthood, like the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, like the Human Rights Campaign, like the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, who are getting monies from big billionaires who are interested in making an influence in the education system, and they give money to these nonprofits who in turn create curriculums and programs, and these nonprofits go to the government and they go to the unions and saying, we'll give you this for free. You don't have to pay a dime. They're completely subsidized by big-time millionaires and billionaires. So we are fighting against them as well because it's so hard for us to come in front of the local school board and say, we need to change the curriculum. Okay, how much is it going to cost? And the next person that comes behind you and says, I'm a local Planned Parenthood representative, and we want to let you know that our comprehensive sexuality education curriculum is free of charge. How do you fight against that, right? So this is how the government, the education ecosystem works. We need to break it up, and I'll show you an idea of how we can do that. Secondly, let's critique the narratives. I would say these are the 5 top most important things that are happening right now in the education system. It's comprehensive sexuality education. It's this whole marriage of transgenderism / mental health. It's critical race theory. It's historical revisionism, and it's social emotional learning. And I just want to give you a little bit about each one, but then give you some resources that you can go and read to find out a lot more. So first of all, comprehensive sexuality education, all developed by Planned Parenthood starting in 2006. They've tried it over 600 times across the United States. There were over 600 different studies. What I want to give you here is tools to combat the narrative. So the narrative is that the old sex education doesn't work. We need comprehensive sexuality education. Remember the definition of the word sexuality that I put in my video? It means everything on top of just biology. So now they got to teach gender and fantasies and behaviors and attitudes and beliefs and eroticism, all of that, right? So there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Stan Weed, and together with Irene Erickson, they did a study back in 2017 and 2018 where they went to our federal Department of Education and they say, can we have access to these 600 plus studies that were done proving that comprehensive sexuality education is the best thing since sliced bread? And they said, sure, here it goes. Out of those 600 studies, they took the top 60 that claimed to be the most effective. And they said, okay, what are the criteria that you used to determine effectiveness? Okay, number 1, did it reduce teen pregnancies? Okay, number 2, did it reduce HIV and AIDS? Number 3, did it delay sexual activity or the initiation of sexual activity in teens? So typically those are the top 3 criteria. Out of all of those 60 best studies, they found that only 6% were effective. Only 6% were effective. The rest of the 94% failed miserably. You see, school board members have no clue about these studies. So when we go up front and we talk to them and we share this and then we share the entire study with them, they are just like, their mind is blown away. And now that puts Planned Parenthood on the defensive because now they have to come forward with their own studies showing that, okay, why am I saying that this one is effective? They also looked at globally, because the United Nations has an arm called the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Council. And within that branch, they're pushing all of this stuff, especially in African nations. Out of the top 43 studies that were done globally, again, same thing with those ones, only 6% were found to be effective. If you go onto their website, the Institute for Research and Evaluation, you could download the study for free and just read it on your own and share it with whoever you want. Secondly, transgenderism and mental health. There is a huge transition now from taking comprehensive sexuality education and bringing it a step further into transgenderism and mental health services. Because what's happened is in the medical field, remember how I told you all these associations exist on this side of the house in the education field? In the medical field, you have the same thing. You have the American Pediatric Association, you have the American Medical and Heart Association. Every one of these different fields of medicine has their own associations. They've all gone Marxist. And they've only done that like in the last 5 to 10 years. And so you have to ask yourself, oh my goodness, like did the science really change? Did we find out something, and why aren't they like being given Nobel Peace Prizes for something, right? No, there's nothing new. It's strictly just the political left going and yelling at them and going to their meetings and putting them out and blasting them in the media that they're homophobic, transphobic. So there's nothing in the science that does any of this. But what they've done is they've shifted all of their manuals for practice that are kind of the industry standards and guidelines to only affirming gender therapy. So if a child comes into the school nurse's office and says, I don't think I'm a boy anymore, I'm a girl, the nurse cannot say, no, you look like a boy to me. She can only, or he can only affirm that whatever's coming out of that child's mouth is reality. There are 2 really good books on this topic that I hope you can read. The first one is called Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. Abigail Shrier is a lawyer, and she's also a writer for the Wall Street Journal and for a couple other publications. But she so brilliantly studied this issue of transgenderism because if we look in history, up until 2011, 2012, all the cases of transgenderism, or the overwhelming majority, over 95%, were happening in prepubescent boys. Ever since 2011, 2012, and onward, it's completely the opposite. 95+% of the cases is happening in girls that are somewhere in the puberty age of like 12 to 16 years old. And when you see that vast shift within data, you have to ask yourself some pretty tough questions. Why? This just can't be all of a sudden. If this kind of what was always deemed a mental illness, it used to be called gender dysphoria, then it became called gender incongruence, and now they've just dealt away with all the terms because it's transphobic. She said, well, something's not adding up. Well, a doctor at Brown University ended up putting out in 2018 in October a study that said, I think I found the answer. What all of these girls have in common is that they are all pretty much typically from middle class, upper middle class, wealthy families. They tend to be white for the most part, and they tend to have access to social media from a very early age. And all of them have followed some way, shape, or form an influencer on Instagram or on YouTube that was a boy before it became a girl, or vice versa. She has a lot of stuff in there that you want to read. Secondly is When Harry Became Sally. This is Ryan T. Anderson. And he talks about his, not just from an education perspective, but he gives a more global societal perspective. Critical race theory. Ask questions. Let's critique the narrative. Who is the oppressor in a biracial family? Is it the husband or the wife? Is it the child who happened to come out darker, or the child who happened to come out lighter, right? How about the black lesbian Chicago mayor? Should we hold her responsible for the crime spree we are seeing in Chicago going on right now? Right? Because they say people in power are the only people that are able to be racist. The new definition of racism is no longer just prejudice. It's prejudice plus power. So people without power, by definition, can't be racist anymore. So question the narrative, question the definitions. If you question the fact that, hey, maybe the creation of the welfare state in the 1960s led to the breakdown of families, which then led to what we see, especially in the black community today? Or is race the key factor in any of these things? See, in schools now, what they do, and especially right now because parents have been talking about this so much, they don't use the word critical race theory anymore. They use the phrase ethnic studies or culturally responsive teaching. That's just new euphemisms, okay? Thomas Sowell is probably one of the most reputable authorities on this topic. He's over 90 years old. Back in his early youth days, he was a Marxist, and he started working within the government system in the state of New York, dealing with a lot of this data, and he started to realize that the narrative doesn't add up. And so over the course of his lifetime, he has been tracking, as an economist, he has been tracking what's going on in the United States. His book called Discrimination and Disparities is absolutely phenomenal on this topic. From CRT comes a whole shift in our history, because now you have to relook back at America through the lens of critical race theory. So CRT is being weaponized to teach us that, well, America was a slaveocracy. America didn't start in 1776. It actually started in 1619 when the first slaves came in on the shores of Virginia. They're going to retwist all of history. A book that I highly recommend is written by a black author, Robert Woodson, who actually started a program called 1776 Unites Project. And he's labeling the book very well here. He's calling it Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers, because that's what they're all doing. And then lastly is social emotional learning. This is the one that gets really crazy and that's most concerning for me, because it takes all of the other things and it combines them into a very short 15-minute program at the beginning of your child's day. This is social emotional learning, children, and right now we're just going to learn about how to be nice to each other. What child doesn't want to be nice, right? What child doesn't want to, be kind to somebody else, all right? Basically what they're doing is they're social engineering, because now by being nice, well, whose definition of nice, right? If you just state your belief or a biological fact that boys are boys and girls are girls, ooh, you've stepped on the wrong landmine. You are not being nice, okay? During this whole pandemic, because now we as parents got to see and watch the Zoom meetings for our kids, right? This is one of the first things that I got to catch on to. And every single morning after they would go through their social emotional learning, and at the first break, I would ask my boys to come and tell me, what did you learn in social emotional learning? And if it was something off, I would immediately email the teacher and say, hey, you brought this topic up. Can you send me the lesson plan that you used? I would get the lesson plan. I would see it, mark it up, send it directly to the principal. And I would say, Madam Principal, look what is being taught in my son's class. I don't agree with it. Please, let's talk and let's change it. In every single instance, I was able to change that. Why? Because when a parent speaks up, when multiple parents speak up, the last thing that school administrators want to do is deal with an angry parent. So they want to listen. Now, a lot of times, those school administrators are Christians, and they can't do something until a parent speaks up. And so they're so grateful when they get a parent who says, please change this. Oh, gladly, yes, this is my cue. So when we speak up, we are giving other Christians who are in the system the opportunity to make changes that otherwise their own, they wouldn't be able to do. There is a lady by the name of Stella Morabito, Family Research Council, has a very good talk. And she has done a lot of research in social emotional learning. And it's basically group think, helping kids think emotionally and not critically or rationally anymore. Because let's face it, if you're being rational, that's a sign of white supremacy. That's what they say. That's what critical race theory teaches our children. So what can godly men do? We need to understand the times, and we ought to do something, okay? Disciple your children. Disciple your children like never before. Every day, talk to them. Talk to them about what they went through school. What did they learn? You might not get anything the first week, the second week, but the second month, the third month, you're going to really get an understanding of what's going on. Pray with them. Read the Bible together with them. Show them how to walk with God at their age, at their level. Expose them to these ideas when appropriate. One of the things that I've started doing with my oldest son, he's in 7th grade now, the Colson Center. You guys know Chuck Colson? So the Colson Center has a great YouTube channel called What Would You Say? And it's geared towards youth and a lot of these topics. And they formulate the entire conversation in these 5-minute videos where you're in a conversation and if someone of your buddies at school says something, what would you say? How do you step in there as a 7th grader, as a 6th grader, and respond to what's being said, right? Now, not all of the videos, again, are meant for 4th or 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th graders, so please watch them ahead of time and then sit down and watch them with your children. This has been very, very helpful. PragerU has come out with a PragerU for Kids. A lot of great little videos that you can show your kids on history, on science, on how to do this. You know, it's really, really cool. Get informed, which is what you're doing now, but obviously I've only given you snippets. You have to go back home and do your own research and let it sink in, simmer on it, and know how to explain it in your own words. Get involved. Join a local parent group. There are plenty of parent groups out there. If there isn't one, start one. If there isn't one, start one. Run for school board. If that's out of the question for you, volunteer and help the person that's running for school board. You know how many precincts they have to walk and hand out flyers and do all of this stuff on their own time? It is exhausting. Volunteer. Now, here's the big idea that I want us to take away. This has been called the third education revolution. There's a book called that I hope that if you want to go and take. It is written by Vishal Mangalwadi. He is an Indian Christian apologist. And he basically threw out this idea and he said, look, we have churches, we have kids out there, we have church buildings that are not being used throughout the week. What if we start schools in churches? We have over 100,000 churches in America. What if every school takes 10, 15 kids? There goes 1.5 million kids, right? Here in California, we are trying right now. Step one is to actually get enough signatures to get on the ballot for 2022. We're trying to make it a law that parents are afforded school choice. $14,000 every year goes into your child's bank account. And you get to choose where you cut that check. Is it your local public schools, which you think that, oh, that's the best school choice option for me and for my kids, so you'll cut them the $14,000? Is it I'm doing homeschooling, my curricula only costs about $5,000, so I'm just gonna pay $5,000 instead of $14,000. And I get to keep that other $9,000 there. I can't use it for anything else other than education, right? So now I'm accumulating maybe year over year. Or maybe I go to my local private school. Maybe that costs $11,000 a year. And again, I'm saving a little bit and I'm accumulating year over year. By the time your child finishes K through 12, you've had 13 years of potentially thousands of dollars accumulating there, which now you can use for college, right? College costs a lot of money. Why is it that we do not give the choice to parents? Because it's coming out of our taxpayer dollars anyway. We're paying for it one way or another. Why not? We get to decide which way it goes. I highly encourage parents to please get behind this. So the California School Choice Foundation, that logo on the bottom there, California School Choice Foundation, they are the ones that are driving this initiative. So just like we had to do signatures to just get on the ballot for the recall, right? That's the same thing we have to do. We need to get 1 million plus signatures in order to get on the ballot, and then once we're on the ballot, we need to get the votes to pass. This will be a game changer. Why is that? Remember I showed you that education ecosystem trifecta? Where do the unions get their money from? Our taxpayer dollars. Okay? So now, if I am taking that $14,000 and not giving it to my local public school system and giving it to my church who's starting a school, what have I just done? I've effectively lowered the amount of money in the public school system. That means they need less teachers. For every teacher that's in the public school system, that's $1,200 less in union dues. Now you might say, well, George, what do you have against teachers in the public school system? No, we need more Christian teachers in the public school system. We need them there to be missionaries and to hold the line because they get to decide a lot of what is being taught or not. I have nothing against teachers, Christian teachers in the public school system. We need more of them, and God bless you if you're one of them. What I am saying, though, is that over time, the entire education ecosystem will change because you'll think, well, George, I want to be an educator there because I also get a lot of great resources, I get enough pay, I get enough benefits. And I said, great, but the church could start doing the same thing? And here's how. Because if a church gets about 100 kids in their local school at $14,000 apiece, how much money is that? That's a lot of money. And the private sector always does things better than the public sector. We can actually have higher wages, better benefits for our teachers. And by the way, in all of that, financial analysis, there are overhead costs that schools have, right? Which now go towards the overhead cost of a building like this, which in the past, churches have had to fork up their own money to start up their own schools and pay the bills and pay the salaries and pay for everything else here, right? Now, the school will also be a blessing to the church. And the church can be a blessing to the school because you can share overhead costs. I believe that we can do this so much better and so much more cost effectively and pay our teachers more in the process. So men, here is the inspiration that I want you to get. Remember that there was another man named Martin Luther who was up against a behemoth. He said this, where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And to be steady on all the battlefields besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. I believe the most critical battle we face in America today is the battle of education. Because if we lose our children, we have lost everything. If we don't care enough for our children to stand up and to fight, I don't know what other subject out there we could care for. What? Open borders? What? I don't know of another topic if it's not our children. I started caring when my daughter was born 4 years ago. And it was then that it finally hit me that I'm holding this precious little girl who would have to go to school and potentially have her privacy violated by a boy going into her restroom. And I said, no way. No way that's ever going to happen. By the time this girl goes to school, George, you have your work cut out for yourself. You need to do something to change the education system. If every godly man in America would rise to the occasion and fight where the battle rages. Now, I know we can give a lot of examples from other places, but I want to bring it back to us as Romanians. We have that badge. We're a former communist nation, right? We can do this, right? What examples do we have from our own history? Well, one of my favorite examples is Fratele Costache Ioanid. And he said this in his song and his poem called Există Dumnezeu. Nu suntem un vis, o întâmplare, un lut de sine însuși frământat, ci ne-a zidit o forță creatoare, o înțelepciune fără de hotare. Există Dumnezeu cu adevărat. Was this man just writing a nice worship song to be sung in church? Or was he being used as an instrument of the Holy Spirit to fight where the battle was raging? What was communism all about? Materialism. Our children, our parents, our grandparents were being taught evolution, creation. No. Check out his next verse. Nu suntem, how do you say this word? Jivine întunecate, gonite de un bici neînduplecat, ci noi avem un duh și o libertate și o inimă ce pentru ceruri bate. Există Dumnezeu cu adevărat. What was he attacking next? The communist ideals against liberty and freedom. No, you are a property of the state. You don't get to own anything. There's no such thing as freedom and liberty. God used him to fight where the battle was raging. N-ar fi simțit în veci de veci țărâna sau râsul unui crin imaculat, de n-ar fi întins a tot stăpânul mâna să umple noi de simțământ fântâna. Există Dumnezeu cu adevărat. You see, in a materialistic worldview, there is no beauty. There is no beauty. How can you look at a sunset and say, that is just a random set of particles? You can't. Avem cu noi Scriptura ca dovadă, avem minuni și semne neîncetat, iar cine vrea pe Dumnezeu să-L vadă, să stea în fața Lui pe baricadă. Există Dumnezeu cu adevărat. Bibliology. What books were smuggled to Romania? Bibles. This verse dealt exactly where the battle was raging. Nu-i calea noastră veșnic înțorită, nu-i viața totdeauna un palat, dar o trăim căci merită trăită. Când peste lumea asta mărginită există Dumnezeu cu adevărat. Communism and Marxism has no answer to suffering. The suffering is just more war. Fight against the rich, rich against the poor. And yet God has the ultimate solution to suffering. Nu suntem neant, ce fericire. Supremul adevăr s-a revelat. Iisus e în noi lumină și iubire, iar moartea e un zbor spre nemurire. Există Dumnezeu, ce minunat. The concept that God exists changes everything, and it also changes everything for eternity, for we do not die with our mortal death here. Fratele Costache Ioanid wrote by inspiration of the Holy Spirit where the battle was raging at that time in communist Romania. What are we willing to do? Are you willing to be used? You might say, well, George, I'm in this, I'm in that, I'm in the other. He was just a poet. God used a poet to inspire a nation. And decades later for us to be blessed by his poetry and his songs. Where are the godly men of Issachar today that understand the times and what we ought to do and fight where the battle is raging? May the Lord help us to be those godly men. Amen. Any questions? I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. third education revolution, the school choice.
Yeah. What do you think? Is it a long shot or it's something that might happen? What do you guys think?
All right, so this has already happened at the beginning of this year in the state of West Virginia. So the state of West Virginia was ground zero for the fight with the teachers' union. 3 years ago, the teachers' union saw this wave of parents being able to start rising up, and so they created a counterattack, and they called it Red for Ed. That was their slogan. So they're wearing red shirts, red apparel. As a counterattack towards it, parents started Purple for Parents. And they worked for the last 3 years in West Virginia. Obviously, West Virginia has a different economy than we do. There, it costs about $5,000 per child per year to get educated. At the beginning of this year, they successfully put it on the ballot and they passed it. So every family now gets $4,600 every single year, and they get to decide what to do with it. Now, because it's such a brand new program, it takes time for the church to react and for other people to react to it. So over the next couple of years, I think we're going to see a huge shift in the state of West Virginia. In California, why I think we stand a chance, number one, we stand a chance to get on the ballot first because we collected enough signatures for the recall. So I'm confident about that. Number two, when it actually comes to voting, we need a 50+1, right? And if you look at the 2020 election, there was one very interesting ballot measure, and that was Prop 16, where it was going to allow racism, basically, affirmative action to be used in college entrances. So that way colleges can say, okay, well, we need more oppressed people to come here, so then we're allowed to get more people of color. And if you were a straight A student and you just happened to be white, well, you don't deserve to be at that college. That proposition went down in the flames, like 57-43 in our favor. I believe that 57% of people who voted for that to go down, they were a huge, predominantly Asian population. Because we know that the Asian community values education. And now all of a sudden, their child, who might have gotten 1595 out of 1600 on their SAT score, was not going to be able to get into USC anymore. Oh, no, I'm going to go to the ballot box and let them have a piece of my mind. I think for that reason, I think we stand a very good chance. The executive director of the movement behind that ballot, Wen Yuan Yu, I've gotten to know her very well, and they are all over this. So I believe that we stand a very good chance. The question becomes, is the church ready to react?
Are there any implementations for those measures? I mean, to have this list ready and to get parents to sign?
Yes, if you go to the California School Choice Foundation website, you can start seeing there. They have been working for the last 6 months on building a volunteer base to go out and collect the signatures. And starting actually this month, they're starting to collect the signatures.
Probably we're going to see them in church.
You probably will start seeing them, yes.
The second question I have, thank you for all that you said this time. It was very nice, very informative, very useful for us. And we kind of think if we got that far, I'm thinking that's an agenda they developed over a long period. And if we got that far, I'm thinking what they are thinking, what the agenda will be for future. Now, do we do anything as church or as Christians to influence the young generation and to influencing our kids to get in the politics, to get into the administration? Because we as Christians just sit, relax, and then God will provide. I don't do anything to inform our kids or to influence our kids to influence the society.
Mihai Luca for local school board. We have one right here. This is what it takes. So, you guys, I was born in Romania. I came here at an early age, but I grew up in the Romanian bubble. okay? So nobody ever taught me what this country's all about, how to get involved, when to get involved, okay? So you just figure it out kind of on your own. But your question is the most important question, because the other side has a whole farm system set up for involvement. They already know who's going to be running for school board 2 years from now. We don't. I'm finally catching up, and catching my breath from doing all of the, parental involvement here to start thinking about, hey, 2022 school board elections are coming up. What are we doing? So we need a good farm system for that. There is an organization called the Leadership Institute. The Leadership Institute provides online training if you want to get involved in running for any kind of political office. They give you training to have a basic understanding of how everything works. The other organization is Family Research Council. They put on their very first school board training. So if you're interested in running for school board. So for now, there's kind of, those are probably the best resources that I know of. The last thing that I will say to that is, as a citizen of the United States of America, it is your duty to get involved. To what degree? Pray about it and let the Lord guide you. But we live in a society that is structured for we the people. And so when you read scripture, and it's very hard when you read like Romans 13, and you should obey your authorities and all of that. In America, when you try to apply scripture to our form of government, who's the ultimate authority in America? It's not the president of the United States. It's not Congress. It is we the people. And so you got to kind of scratch sometimes, because you got to see like, what does that mean? I have to listen to this or to that or to this. The Constitution was intentionally designed this way, where the ultimate power and authority stands with we the people. So that means we have every right to go and start getting involved. We just don't. So we need to.
So I actually attended my first school board meeting. So we're in the Placentia Yorba Linda School District, and there was a big issue with the vaccine mandates. And my question, and actually very hard, because there were over 65 parents that spoke up that night. So when you made that comment about them shutting down that comment section, that should be very concerning to parents. So my question for you is, so there's this big sit-out, organized sit-out on Monday. Mm-hmm. How impactful, or what impact does that really make? And how does that impact the school district? Should all parents be participating in that? Or what are your thoughts on these organized sit-outs? I feel like we did one a couple years ago against the whole new sexual education curriculum, and I feel like I kept my kids home, but I don't know how impactful it was, and yeah.
Sure.
If you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so let me give you some of the thoughts behind the ones in 2019. So with Informed Parents of California, I helped organize in January 2019, March 2019, and May 2019, the statewide sit-outs. What we saw after those was a tremendous concern on the part of school administrators and officials. There was one particular school here in Orange County who had a very high Asian population, and who we work with a very influential pastor in the Asian community who spread the word in their community like wildfire. 42% of students in that school were absent that day. The principal was calling parents saying, please come tonight, we're gonna have a special meeting, I wanna hear you guys out. Up until then, we were chanting, we were protesting, we were doing other things. Until we took them out, they wouldn't listen. Now, it worked then because every single day, there's a formula for how much, for every unexcused absence, right? There's a formula for how much dollars of federal funding that the school loses. The issue that we have today is that I don't think they're necessarily going to lose money, because until next fiscal year, what the governor did is he said, you know what, we have a surplus in California. So we're going to fund the public school system according to the amount of bodies we had pre-COVID. So even if you take kids out of the public school system, that local school district's not losing $15,000 anymore for last school year and for this school year. He would have to do that in perpetuity for future school years. So right now, I don't think there will be a financial loss to those school districts, but they are all thinking about what happens next year. And if that child doesn't come right back into that seat the following year, it's going to be game over soon. Over the last 2 school years, so in April of this year, they finally published how many kids were removed from the school system. It was 150,000 here in California. I have an inside mole, I call her, in the State Department of Education. She works pretty high up there, and I asked her, I said, tell me how many children we need to get out in order to just bankrupt the system, make it collapse. And she said about 1 million out of the 6.2. 150,000. That's 15%. We reached it in 1 year. I never thought that would be possible. But God always works in mysterious ways, even through COVID. So I would say my personal opinion is, yes, they are effective. And this time around, it will lose its financial sting, but it sends a message for next year. This time around, also, the message is not just public schools, but private schools. And for them, even though you sit out, they don't lose because you've already paid your tuition, right? They don't work the same way financially as public schools. But that's also a sign for them that if you're going to comply with an unconstitutional vaccine mandate, I'm not going to send my child to your private school. And private schools are much more cautious about money. So that's going to be a huge message to private schools, because the current mandate, once the FDA approves the vaccine, is this goes for all public and private schools. There's a microphone back there.
So what do we tell the school on Monday why we're not taking them to school?
You can tell them whatever you want, but make sure just to say, I want my child to be labeled as unexcused. That's it. Because if they don't, and ask for proof. I always email them, so I have an email that I sent them, and then I also ask them to respond to me with proof that he was actually labeled in the system as unexcused. Because a lot of times, remember, we're dealing with some immoral people. They will go and they'll just mark your child as absent, not as unexcused. Any other questions? So we have a person running for school board. We have a person who's participating at school board meetings. This is going to be a great, great turnout in the coming election here. Remember, godly men.
If the program that you mentioned passes, what can the church do to, I know we're behind the start where we should be, but what can we do to catch up, to be ready for that?
All right, so the fastest way for churches to be able to catch up and react to this is if you work with an accredited Christian organization that can come in and set you up. Here in Yorba Linda, we actually happen to have a brother. His name is Cecile Sweatland. I've got to meet with him a few times already. He is the Western District Director for the Association of Christian Schools International. It's a huge accrediting organization. They have over 400 schools, accredited schools in California alone that they work with. And he told me, he said, George, we've worked with churches who have come to us and they said, look, it was the end of the school year, in June, and they wanted to have a school up and running in September. We made it happen. So there are organizations that can make this happen for you if you are willing and if you put in the time. They will gladly come in and help you set it all up, help you find teachers, recruit teachers, hire proper administrators, set you up with all of the financial structures that you need. And he lives right here. I think his office is off of like Brea Boulevard somewhere. So
The bigger the church, the more likely that we can get it running because we have teachers in our church who could get involved.
That's one thing. Also think about your community. How many non-Christian parents would love to send their kids to a private school, and now they have $14,000 to do it with, right? And they can just walk their child to school every single day, or if they're old enough, their child could just walk to school every single day, and they don't have to worry about that. It is a game changer. Game changer. I know so many parents who are driving an hour in each direction to take their child to the right private school. And these aren't millionaire parents. These are parents who are just working just as hard as we are day to day in their jobs, but they've restructured their finances accordingly for their families because that's what they feel is the most important for them. Yes.
Well, I know there's a couple of teachers here tonight, and I happen to teach at a primary elementary level. I teach second grade. I taught kinder for 10 years, and my first year teaching second. And I'm just wondering, we're in the line of fire, and I'm really in the line of fire with my superintendent and my assistant superintendent because I'm very vocal. But I was just wondering how you can encourage the few of us that are here tonight. What are some tips you can give us? Some things we should or shouldn't say, how much we should say. I have been doing everything in writing, and interestingly enough, when I was asking questions in regards to this whole vaccination issue, my school nurse, she said, can we step outside? And I thought I was going to get in trouble, and she told me, you know, I'm so glad you came to ask me, because now I know there's another one like me. And so that was so comforting to know that there's somebody else at school, our school nurse, who happens to have the same beliefs as me. And sadly, yesterday after school, she had called my room and asked if she could come and just say goodbye. And I didn't know. She had collected all her stuff from her office. She basically got put on unpaid leave. So today was the first day we had a sub nurse at school, and probably thereafter, she was asked not to come to work today or thereafter.
And let me guess, the teachers union is not representing her, not providing any. Does she know about Christian Educators Association International? So for teachers here, the first thing that I recommend is leave your union. The Supreme Court ruling in 2018, the Janus ruling, gives you that right, and you cannot be reprimanded for it. So you have to do that first and foremost. Secondly, why do teachers join the union? Because the union kind of bullies you into thinking that, well, if you're not part of us, then we won't represent you legally. Well, they're not going to represent you legally anyway because they have their own Marxist ideology. And so when you want to step up for your beliefs, they just get to decide on their own, saying, hey, I'm not going to represent you, but I'll keep on taking the $1,200 from you. So David Schmoose, who also happens to live here in Yorba Linda, he's the president of the Christian Educators Association International. For a third of the cost, I think it's $450 per year. If you pay that due, they actually give you twice the amount of legal representation. I had a Romanian teacher up in the Fresno area 2 years ago who reached out to me because she started speaking her mind, and she got placed on leave, like an indefinite leave. She was an art teacher, and her union wasn't going to represent her. So I got her in touch with David. Their organization has a slew of lawyers on their team, and she got the representation she needed. She got reinstated 10 days later, got her paycheck and everything, and that just emboldened her to continue speaking. But that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is there is another organization called Gateways for Better Education, Eric Buer, Gateways for Better Education. And this brother understands the education code in California like the back of his hand. He actually has, for the month of October, every Wednesday night, he's doing a seminar for teachers, a webinar. So you just have to, on Zoom. What he's trying to do is he's trying to get all of these Christian teachers across California connected. So that way you get to know that other teacher is, and she might be in your school. She might be in your school district, right? And then you guys can start formulating plans on how to work together. And then you guys can start saying, hey, your church is down the street from my church. Maybe we should talk to our pastors about this too and get our church to start helping us as well. Maybe we get to learn about other teachers in my church. He's trying to build this network of teachers that can feel like they have something to be a part of, share lessons learned, share experiences, support each other, and be part of that pushback.
Is this material that you presented this night available to download and to access? Because that's a lot of information. We couldn't keep up with everything.
It's all proprietary, no. It's being recorded, so it'll, and then the PowerPoint itself, I will share it with Benny, and then if you need to get it, get it from Benny. Also,
The extra links that you have, advise us to get to in the Q&A.
All of this extra stuff, that you're just going to have to re-listen to the video. There's just so much in my mind to share. I don't have it necessarily all down somewhere, but I will say, if you go to protectourkidsnow.org, which is the organization that I currently focus on most of my time, on our website we have a bunch of this information. So like the YouTube videos that I showed here, they're PragerU style. We have a lot more of those there as well that you can share with other parents. Brochures that also break this stuff down. Everything is there on the website. I think Pastor Creaney is saying something.
Let's thank George. George, 2022 for the elections, I do have an idea who can run for some. I think you're the most qualified among us. Mulțumim tare mult pentru toate informațiile pe care ne le-ai adus. Într-adevăr, they are very important și chiar dacă l-am știut câteva its and bits, modul în care tu le-ai pus împreună ne-a demonstrat încă o dată că trebuie să ne implicăm, că trebuie să stăm în picioare pentru ceea ce credem și că putem să facem o diferență. Acum nu știu ce se întâmplă, că atâția din ăștia oameni importanți sunt aici în Iorba Linda, în apropiere de noi și deja am început să fie frică. You know. Domnul să lucreze și Domnul să ne ajute să putem să ne facem noi partea. De multe ori ne credem că suntem niște români care am rămas aici și noi nu avem nicio voce, and we don't have a voice. Well, we do. We are American citizens and we should speak up. Pentru că așa cum I'm not trying să pun pe Americans jos, dar ei nu știu ce se întâmplă. Noi știm, avem un pic ideea ce se întâmplă și we kind of see through it, exact cum ai zis tu. Și încă o dată îți mulțumesc tare, tare mult că ai venit și mi se pare că luna viitoare, nu, Benny? Luna viitoare mai este ai un alt topic și te așteptăm cu nerăbdare să vii și să ne mai împărtășești din câte ai. Văzându-te cât de bine îți aminteai toate organizațiile, toate numele, am zis, man, ești o enciclopedie, Domnul să te binecuvânteze și știți ce aș vrea? Aș vrea ca să ne rugăm pentru George. Pentru că ceea ce a făcut el a intrat pe teritoriul satanei. Și for sure satana o să încearcă să-l lovească, să lovească în familia lui, în casa lui. Sper să greșesc, dar am sure că are și el atacurile lui, pentru că ori de câte ori îl calci pe satana pe coadă și ăla nu stă liniștit. El vrea să stăm noi liniștiți, să nu zicem nimic. Dar în momentul în care spui ceva, în momentul în care intri pe teritoriul lui, o să se bată și o să răspundă. So, aș vrea să ne rugăm pentru el. Cristi, tu vii aici la rugăciune, o să ai rugăciune, nu? Yes. Haide și te rog în rugăciunea ta să te rogi și pentru George. Vă invit să ne ridicăm în picioare pentru rugăciune.
Doamne, Tatăl nostru care ești în ceruri, în numele scump al Domnului nostru Iisus Hristos, stăm înaintea Ta să-ți mulțumim, Dumnezeu nostru, pentru că ne deschizi ochii și ne deschizi mintea să vedem ce se întâmplă în școlile unde copiii noștri, Doamne, învață. Doamne, Tatăl nostru din ceruri, te rugăm în numele Domnului Iisus Hristos. Ai milă, Doamne, de acești profesori care sunt în bordul de conducere a tuturor școlurilor în America și în altă parte. Te rugăm, Dumnezeul nostru, ai milă de ei, îndură-te de ei, deschide-le mintea și deschide-le, Doamne, inima pentru cuvântul Tău. Mă rog, Doamne, pentru acei profesori, pentru acei educatori, pentru acei membri din bordul de conducere din diferite școli. Te rugăm, Dumnezeul nostru, îndură-te de ei, de casele lor, de familiile lor și de cei care, Doamne, nu și-au plecat, Doamne, conștiința, Doamne, în fața unui sistem demonic. Doamne, te rugăm, Doamne, ai milă de ei. Susține-i, Doamne, în mâna Ta, ține-i în mâna Ta pe acei oameni, Doamne, care nu și-au plecat, Doamne, cugetul, nu și-au plecat, Doamne, valorile lor morale, valorile lor familiare în fața unui sistem care vrea să distrugă familia. Te rugăm, Dumnezeul nostru, ai milă de ei, ține în brațul Tău, ține-i în mâna Ta, Dumnezeul nostru. Te rugăm, Doamne, pentru George, pentru familia lui, pentru copiii lui, Doamne, dă-le, Doamne, putere, dă-le, Doamne, încredere, dă-le, Doamne, tărie, ca tot ce vor face, Doamne, fac pentru slava și gloria numelui Tău. Te rugăm, Dumnezeul nostru, acum, pentru fiecare părinte. Știm, Dumnezeul nostru, că fără de Tine noi nu putem face nimic. Fără de puterea Duhului Tău cel Sfânt și înțelepciunea care vine de la El, Dumnezeul nostru, noi nu putem să mergem mai departe. Te rugăm, Doamne, pentru fiecare părinte, fiecare bunic, să ai milă de el, Doamne, și să pui, Doamne, în inima părintelui, Doamne, aceste valori, Doamne, pe care Dumnezeul nostru Tu le-ai creat de la întemeierea lumii, ca să stea de vorbă cu copilul, să se roage, să citească Biblia și să îmbrățișeze, Doamne, cuvântul Tău și să iubească cuvântul Tău. Te rugăm, Dumnezeul nostru, pune în inima fiecărui părinte, Doamne, aceste dorințe, Doamne, de a Te urma pe Tine și de a îmbrățișa cuvântul Tău. Și Te rugăm, Dumnezeul nostru, așa cum a spus, Doamne, fratele nostru, Traian Dors, Doamne, întindeți mâna albă. Întindeți mâna albă, Doamne, când trec pe lângă iad și calea luminează, Iisuse, să nu cad. Doamne, să nu cădem în deznădejde, să nu cădem în nepăsare, să nu cădem în indiferență. Întindeți mâna albă, Doamne, peste noi, peste casele noastre, peste comunitățile creștine, Doamne, din această țară. Hai milă de ele și hai milă de noi. Și noi îți mulțumim și Te rugăm, Doamne, slobăzește-ne, Doamne, în pace. Fii cu noi și rămâi cu noi. Te binecuvântăm și Te slăvim și Te adorăm, Tată, Fiule și Duhul Sfinte veci. Amin.
Vă rog să ocupați locurile. Este 9:30 și parcă a trecut așa de repede timpul, dar am învățat multe. Și încă o dată, George, mulțumim tare, tare mult. Domnul să binecuvânteze pe tine, familia ta, casa ta și toți cei cu care lucrezi. Iată că ceea ce ai început acum 4 ani, nu? A început să prindă roade și să vede tot mai mult cum tot mai mulți oameni vin on board. Iar despre noi, haideți să ajutăm cauza aceasta, haideți să fim alături de George și când George o să ne dai un semnal, we'll do our part. Vrem să facem lucrul acesta. Încă o dată vă mulțumesc tuturor, mulțumesc cei de la Men's Ministry, Ben, Mircea, Cristi și toți ceilalți echipa. Mulțumim celor de la Sound System, de la video, celor care ne-au urmărit pe YouTube. Domnul să vă binecuvânteze și bărbaților. George ne-a vorbit în această seară. Haideți să ne luăm în serios rolul de cap de familie și de părinți. God bless you. Următoarea întâlnire la Men's Ministry este în 19 noiembrie, dacă mă amintesc bine, Beni, da? 19 noiembrie, vineri 19 noiembrie avem un alt seminar tot cu George. Acum suntem liberi, ne vedem cu ajutorul Domnului duminică la church. Am uitat să mulțumesc grupului de închinare. God bless you guys. Mulțumim. Amen.